Whoa, what is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And in this video, we're going to talk about the topic that is still on all of our minds, the most important position of a football team. I want to lay out all the realistic options that I think the New York Giants could decide to do at the quarterback position regarding whether it's Daniel Jones or whether it's not. Of course, Daniel Jones, the most important player on this team, is a free agent. And as of now, yes, we've heard reports, we've heard from Joe Schoen himself that the plan is to bring Daniel Jones back, but we'll see how it all plays out. As of now, Daniel Jones currently is not a member of the 2023 New York Giants. He's set to hit free agency on March 13th. The tag deadline is on March 7th. I've come out and given my opinion as to what I think they should do, what I think they ultimately will do, which I personally think if they do not get a contract extension done by March 7th, I think they will ultimately tag Daniel Jones and then try to work out a long-term extension. And I've talked about why I think that is in the best long-term interest of the New York Giants. But I want to give a thorough analysis and kind of present the options that I think the New York Giants have at the quarterback position for the 2023 season and beyond. And then I'm not even going to give my opinion on the matter. You guys can come up with your own opinions in the comments below, and you let me know what you think the best option for the New York Giants is at the quarterback position for 2023 based off the evidence that I'm going to provide, based off what it would take to do what you may want to do at the quarterback position. I think there's three realistic scenarios, and I'll talk about all of them from within this video. The first thing I'm going to do is talk about things that I do not think are realistic scenarios that I've seen people say, whether it be on Twitter, whether it be on YouTube, whether it be people writing articles, whatever. The first thing is replace Daniel Jones with a cheap alternative at quarterback. Whether that be start Tyrod Taylor, whether that be start, Jacoby Brissett or a Marcus Mariota, basically replace Daniel Jones with a guy that makes $10 million or less, Mitch Trubisky, $10 million or less, and have him be the starter this year. Don't draft a quarterback. Just play out the year based off where we're picking and then essentially tank. That's the way I look at it. Essentially try to get a better draft pick next year because you don't believe in your quarterback. If you could convince yourself that bringing in Mitch Trubisky and having an extra $20 million in cap space or 20, whatever it is, it would be 20. Because if you sign him an extension, you're going to have a ton of cap space because you're not going to go $35 million against the cap. And we'll go into further detail with that. If you were to tag him, it would be 32.4. So if you're going to convince yourself that having Mitch Trubisky and having an extra $20 to $22 million in cap space is going to give you a better opportunity to win games in 2023, that's your opinion. I strongly disagree with it. Or having Jacoby Brissett, or having Tyrod Taylor, having a guy that has not been a proven winner at the NFL level. After all, Daniel Jones last year was 9-6-1 as a starter for the New York Giants. He's 11-7-1 dating back to his three last regular season starts the year before. So he proved last year with the proper coaching staff that he can win and get a team to the playoffs and win a playoff football game. Something that the New York Giants had not done since 2012 with a less than great supporting cast. I think you could also make an argument that the Giants had the worst supporting cast of any team that was in the playoffs. Daniel Jones got them to the second round of the playoffs with that. So you're taking a step back if you replace Daniel Jones with one of these guys that I've seen people bring up. And I can't see John Mara, Joe Schoen, and Brian Daboll intentionally taking a step back this year because they don't want to pay Daniel Jones a couple of extra $1 million when they have the option to franchise tag him. So if you guys in the comments could come up with one scenario in the history of football where that has happened, let me know. Maybe there's one where a team made the playoffs, did not draft a quarterback the next year to replace him, but they replaced him with the backup or replaced him with a guy that was thought to be a backup or a fringe starter. I just don't see that happening when the quarterback was entering free agency. I think if you're going to replace Jones, and we'll get into that realistic scenario in a bit, the only option, unless you're bringing an established starter, which I'll also talk about as well, is via the draft. Because you have to sell your fan base on hope. You have to sell your fan base on something that could eventually evolve into something. I don't think that you could sell your fan base off the year that we had last year on essentially tanking for a year and then hoping you get the first pick or a top 3 pick and you're able to get your quarterback. So I don't see that being a realistic scenario. The other scenario I've seen people bring up is the New York Giants can replace Daniel Jones with a more established quarterback that will probably cost just as much, maybe slightly less, but right in the ballpark of what it would cost to retain Daniel Jones. You've heard names like Jimmy Garoppolo. You've heard names like Carr. Maybe a guy like Geno Smith. All those guys are in the ballpark. Aaron Rodgers you'd have to trade for. Lamar Jackson you'd probably have to trade for because at the end of the day, the Baltimore Ravens would tag him. They're not going to just let him go, I would think. They would tag him and then trade him if a team was interested in his services. So those are completely different scenarios, and I don't see either one of those scenarios happening. I don't think the Giants are going to try to trade for a 40-year-old quarterback, And maybe Lamar Jackson becomes available, but at that point, you'd probably have to pay him $55-60 million and give up a ton of draft capital. I don't see the New York Giants doing that either. They're replacing him with a guy like Carr or Garoppolo. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me either. Those guys are older. Those guys have not played from within this offense. Daniel Jones presents more hope for this fan base that he could potentially evolve into something. And I do think Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll have more faith in him, being that they've worked with him. Joe Schoen talked about that in his closing press conference, how he's going to value players higher that they know them from within the building. They know their work ethic. They know that the way they work. So to me, that already got rid of all the unrealistic scenarios. I don't see us replacing Daniel Jones with a fringe starter or a starter that many feel are on the same level. A guy like Carr, a guy like Garoppolo. I don't see that happening. So that's out. So to me, it comes down to three realistic scenarios. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. And I'm going to talk about the ramifications to each scenario. What are the pros? What are the cons to each scenario that the New York Giants may come up with? And why, in the end, I think the contract extension is the best case if it is under a reasonable contract. But we'll talk about all of it in the video. Let's first talk about the draft. Because every year you get it. Last year you got it with Malik Willis. This year you're getting people that are saying we should trade up for a quarterback. And I will admit that this is at least a realistic scenario. If the Giants elect to go this route, I will support it. I will say to myself, okay, Joe Schoen is identifying this guy as the next top tier Joe Burrow. I'm not going to say identical to these guys, but in that class, he thinks they could reach that class of the Joe Burrows, of the Pat Mahomes level quarterback. If he's willing to give up what I think it's going to take to move up to get one of these quarterbacks. Let's look at the draft order. If this is your plan, that you will have to come to the conclusion that Daniel Jones won't be back prior to the draft. So if everybody that just says, well, you could wait at 25 and see what happens. No, you can't do that. Because at that point, if these guys don't fall to you, well, then you're starting Tyrod Taylor next year. I just don't see that happening. I don't think that's going to be the plan for the New York Giants. So if the Giants wanted to go up and get a Anthony Richardson, a Will Levis, a CJ Stroud, a Bryce Young, they would have to trade up in the draft. Right now, they're picking at 25. Now, they're probably not going to get up to 1. I can't see them possibly being willing to give up the draft capital that it would take to get up to 1, and I think it would be incredibly counterproductive. So, to me, that kind of knocks out the Bryce Young possibility, and it kind of knocks out the CJ Stroud possibility, because I see both those guys going from within the top 4 picks of this year's draft and jumping from 25 to 1 or 25 to 4. I just don't think that's realistic. And maybe Anthony Richardson becomes that second guy. But at that point, you're looking at the 3rd and 4 option, which at this point, I think most people would agree is Will Levis and Anthony Richardson. So what would the cost be to jump from 25 to 8? Because I think you have to get above 9 to ensure you're going to get at least one of those guys. Because you look at it, you've got Houston could use a quarterback. We won't even mention Chicago, even though I think they could take a quarterback. But at a bare minimum, I think they're going to trade down if they want to keep Justin Fields, and somebody's going to move up to their spot and take a quarterback. But you have Houston, you have Indianapolis, you have Seattle potentially could take one, you have Detroit could potentially take one because they're thinking long-term where they're picking in the draft. Possible. The Raiders certainly could take one. Atlanta could take one. Carolina could take one. Tennessee could even potentially take one, right? The Jets could take one if one fell to them. Depending on what they do in free agency leading up into the draft. And then that New England could take one. Washington could take one. There are so many teams that could take a quarterback. So if that's your plan, you have to get up into the top 8. In my opinion, if you have to ensure it. It's kind of like what the Jets did during the draft when they traded up to get Sam Darnold at 3. They made their move long before the draft because they said, this is our plan. We're going to make sure we get one of these quarterbacks. Well, to make sure that the New York Giants are going to be able to get one of those quarterbacks, that's what they're going to have to do. And what would it cost to jump from 25 to 8 or 25 to 7 or 25 to 6 or 25 to 9? What would it cost? I think it's costing you 25th and 2 first-round picks and potentially more. But I think it's going to cost at least that when you look back at prior history with quarterback trades. You look at the Chicago Bears when they jumped up, I think it was from 20 to 11 with us. They had to give up their 20th pick. They had to give up a future first, and they had to give up, I think it was an additional 4th or 5th, whatever it was. That was from 20 to 11. You're talking about from 25 to 7 or 8. I think it would cost you 2 additional first along with the 25th pick. That's what I think you're looking at if you're going from 25 to 7 or 8. And is it worth that? Well, if they identify that it is, they're telling me that Anthony Richardson or Will Levis or the quarterback that they're trading up for is the next level tier quarterback of that. So as a fan, I'll be excited. I'll say to myself, okay, Joe Schoen thinks Anthony Richardson is going to be the next Joe Burrow. He thinks he's going to be the next Pat Mahomes, because that would be the only reason why you'd be willing to give up that much draft capital in a situation that the New York Giants are currently in with all the holes that they have on their roster. Do I think ultimately that is what they're going to do? No. I think it's why you've seen Joe Schoen be as forthcoming as he's been, saying that they expect Daniel Jones back, to which some people may say, well, they could tag Daniel Jones and they could still do something like that. At that point, why'd you tag Daniel Jones? If you're willing to give up that much draft capital to move up from 25 to 8, what is the purpose of tagging Jones? Now, if you want to make the argument that they may take a Hendon Hooker if he falls at 25, if they really like him, I suppose that's possible. I don't think it's very likely. I think if your plan is to keep Jones, you're not drafting a quarterback in this year's draft. The only scenario where I see the Giants drafting an early quarterback in this year's draft, could they take one in the third and fourth? That's a different discussion. But an early quarterback in this year's draft, first-round quarterback, whether it be at 25 or whether it be trading up from 25, Daniel Jones will not be franchise tagged. Daniel Jones will not be signed with this football team. Do I view that as at least a possible scenario? Yes. But that is the price that it would cost. Okay? And every decision that the New York Giants are going to make is going to have negative implications. There's going to be pros and cons to each situation. And as a fan, you have to say to yourself, what's the most, I guess, this is how I think about these things. When I think, when I come to the determination, what I think the best course of action is, you have to ask yourself which situation has the best probability of success. I mentioned it to Authentic on Twitter, who constantly debates with me on this topic. It's like voting for the president. When you make when you vote for the president, it's not like you're saying to yourself, well, I'm more sure than not that this guy's going to do a great job. You're saying to yourself, there's a higher probability that this guy's going to do a better job than this guy. And I think that's how Joe Schoen has to analyze these possibilities. What gives his team the best opportunity to hoist the Lombardi Trophy within 5 years? And if he feels one of these quarterbacks are Mahomes or Burrow level talent and he could get them, that's what he'll do. But if he doesn't, he's going to stick with Daniel Jones. That's the way I see it. And in the end, based off the things that he said, I think he's going to stick with Daniel Jones with all the holes we have on this roster, and he's going to keep building the football team. That's just what I think. But am I completely negating that as a possibility? No, it's a possibility. Until such time Daniel Jones signs with the New York Giants, that's a possibility. Now, let's talk about the other two possibilities, realistic possibilities, in my opinion. They both involve bringing back Daniel Jones. One is the franchise tag. One is a multi-year contract. If you're going to go the multi-year contract route, I think the longer the contract, the better, and I'll talk about that in further detail. That doesn't mean the commitment is longer. It means you could space out the money more. And, of course, they're going to have to come to an agreement. And, of course, Daniel Jones is going to have to lower his expectations. And it may involve the New York Giants initially tagging Jones and then working out a contract extension before the year starts. First, let's talk about the tag. Let's talk about the pros of the tag. The obvious pro of the tag, as I've talked about before, if you tag Daniel Jones, it's a 1-year commitment. It's a put up or shut up year. That's it. You get $32.4 million fully guaranteed, and you get to prove whether or not you can get this team back to the playoffs. If you get the team back to the playoffs, well, then you fall into the potential trap. This is what I fear that the Dallas Cowboys did. Dak Prescott got tagged, proved himself, got tagged again. When you do that, you can't move the money around. So in this scenario, Daniel Jones gets 32.4 fully guaranteed. Then he gets 38 guaranteed if you don't want to sign the extension then. If you tag him this year and he gets you back to the playoffs and he puts you in a situation similar to this year where you're not really in a spot to draft the quarterback, you don't want to give up 4 draft picks to move up and get one, you either have to tag him for 38 fully guaranteed, which makes it harder to build a roster, or you have to give him an extension where you pay him more on a per year average. Instead of paying him 35 to 38, you're probably talking in the ballpark of 45. Next year, 45 is going to look closer to 38. That's just the way it works because the market goes up every year, right? Or maybe 42 to 45. That would be probably the ballpark on a per year average if you decide to take him this year. So you're kind of just making what you may feel as a fan the problem worse if you tag him and then he proves the Giants wrong again, because that's what he did this year. This year, the Giants bet against Daniel Jones. They denied the fifth-year option. He got them to the second round of the playoffs, and now he put them in this situation where they have to decide what to do because they're not in an ideal situation to draft a quarterback. Daniel Jones improved as a player. He proved a lot of things from within that locker room. The players buy into him. So now it's either you trade up a ton of draft capital to go up and get that future guy that you're going to at least present that you think is the next future superstar quarterback in the NFL, or you push forward with Daniel Jones with one of these two options. If you tag him, you could be in the same exact situation next year, but it could be even worse. And we also have that played out with the Dallas Cowboys. They tagged Dak once, they tagged him a second time, and then they paid him as the highest paid quarterback in football, or among one of the highest paid quarterbacks in football at the time on a per year average. And I don't have the Dak contract details in front of me. I know this year he's due to take up, I think, over 20% of the salary cap for the Dallas Cowboys. And when you factor in those franchise tags, he was doing the same thing. So when you franchise tag a player, say they went this route with Daniel Jones, yes, it is a shorter commitment. The negative aspect of it is, one, it's harder to analyze Daniel Jones because you don't have as much cap flexibility if you were to do the extension. But two, it forces you, if you want to bring in players, to try to analyze Daniel Jones this year, which I have to think the goal would be if you were to bring him back. It's going to force you to backload other salaries. If you were to sign a new extension, it would kind of level out the money and it would give you more freedom to build the team accordingly year to year. That's the pro to the extension. The only positive to the franchise tag, and I don't think the Giants ultimately want Daniel Jones to play on the franchise tag. They may tag him to lower his demands if he's in that $45 million ballpark. But the only pro is it's an easy out after 1 year. And listen, if Daniel Jones flops next year and the Giants win 5 or 6 games, that's the better alternative. So if you're of the mindset that you think this was all false, this is all, a mirage last year, and the New York Giants are not going to win 9 games next year, and they're not going to compete to make the playoffs next year, and we're going to have a top 10 pick next year, and we're going to be in the position to draft the quarterback next year, then you rightfully would be of the belief that this team's best course of action, if they're not going to trade up for a quarterback this year, in the world of realistic possibilities, would be to franchise tag Daniel Jones and then move on from next year, which is a very fair opinion. Option 3 is a multi-year extension for Daniel Jones, where you see the figures and everybody's jaws drop and they go bananas and they go crazy. I'm going to pull up a contract that I think would be eerily similar to what Daniel Jones would sign for, and that's Jimmy Garoppolo's, and we're going to talk about that in a second. When Jimmy Garoppolo signed the extension with the San Francisco 49ers, it was a 5-year deal for, I think it was 100 and whatever it was $27.5 million a year, 5 years. So you do the math if you're watching the video. I think it was about 130 and change overall. 5 years, 27.5 per year, off a salary cap that was either 172 or 177. I think it was 172. I know that it equaled out to 15.5% of the initial cap that he signed for, which is all that you could base it on. You can't project future cap. You don't know what numbers are going to come in. But his per year salary at 27.5 equated to 15.5% of the 2018 cap. Okay? And we'll pull up the contract and how they structured it so that they were able to build the team. But obviously, the strongest argument to not give Daniel Jones a long-term extension is you think it's going to hurt their ability to build a team. And of course, it's going to hurt it to some extent. Quarterbacks make a lot of money. But I think it's fair to say that the San Francisco 49ers, over the course of that Jimmy Garoppolo contract, built as good of a team as any team in football. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to drafting for Joe Shane, but it certainly didn't limit their ability to extend guys like George Kittle, to extend guys like Deebo Samuel, to extend guys like Fred Warner. They were able to do all of this while they were paying Jimmy Garoppolo that type of salary. So to me, that's a myth. And the way that you could structure this, we're going to look at the way the 49ers did it with Garoppolo, and I'll talk about the way that I could see the Giants doing it in a similar fashion, maybe not an identical fashion, to be able to keep players like Dexter Lawrence, keep players like Andrew Thomas, bring in a free agent here or there, right? There's ways to go about doing it, and teams do it all the time in the NFL. This is not equivalent to the Dak Prescott. I see that a lot. This is not equivalent to the Dak Prescott. I understand if you're looking at the contracts now, you see that Dak is making $40 million a year on average. Dak signed that contract, I think, 3 years ago. $40 million 3 years ago is 52, 53 today because the market goes up. This is a Garoppolo-like signing. Garoppolo signed for 15.5% of the salary cap when he signed that deal, right? You look at a guy like Kyler Murray, who last year signed for $46 million a year on average when the salary cap was like $200 million or thereabouts, right around there. That would have been 23%. We're talking about 15.5%. So that's a difference. This is not a franchise quarterback contract if Daniel Jones were to sign for $35 million a year, which would be 15.5% of this year's salary cap. This is a starting quarterback's contract, a well-paid starting quarterback's contract, but it's certainly not a franchise quarterback commitment. But this is the way that they broke down the Jimmy Garoppolo contract. If you look all the way to the right, that's the number against the cap. And that's the percentage that it went against the cap. So as I told you earlier, the contract on that year's salary cap was 15.5% against the cap. Now, what the Niners elected to do was pay him $37 million against the cap year one. And I don't have the whole Niners team in front of me for 2018. Garoppolo, at that point, I think only had 9 starts to his name, maybe 10, 4 or 5 with the Patriots. He had 5 starts with the Niners after they made the trade, played well in those games, went 5-0, and then they elected to give him the contract extension, which equated to 15.5% of the cap at the time, $27.5 million over a 5-year span. Year one, they actually decided to front load it. I don't think the Giants would do this, and I'll talk about it in more extent throughout the video. They could manipulate it any way they may want. They decided to front load it, and it went 15.6% against the cap. Year two, at $20 million, it was only 8.6%, then 12.9%, then 13.9%, then 6.6%. All, reasonable numbers that you could still build your team with a quarterback, and they left themselves out as the contract went along. Because the team had success, they kept Jimmy Garoppolo around for the ride. But had it bombed, they could have been able to get out in 3 years. And I have no doubt the New York Giants would be able to do something very similar. And in the end, the Niners got to a point. They made a Super Bowl. They made an NFC title game. But they said to themselves, Jimmy is not a guy that could get us to the finish line. He did a great job getting us to where we are now. We're right there. We could see the finish line. We see the checkered stripe. But he can't quite get us there. We're going to trade all our picks now that we've built up this team. Thank you, Jimmy, for helping assist us build this team to where we've gotten. We're going to do what we got to do now to get the guy that could get us across the finish line. That's how that played out, okay? That's why the 49ers elected to go with Trey Lance. But they were able to build their team. I don't think anybody could debate that. And I think that's the biggest argument that people make against the extension of Daniel Jones. The other thing I'll say is I've seen people structure several different contracts. I've seen it. What I think they would elect to do was would go low year one, 15 million or so against the cap, maybe 20 to 25 million against the cap year two, and then a big cap at year three. But the way I look at that is it's kind of year three is your franchise tag. Because if it's $45 to $50 million against the cap, well, in 3 years, $45 or $50 million against the cap would be your franchise tag. And if Jones is playing well after 2 years, you could rip up the contract and you could extend them again and do a very similar layup where it's 8 to 10% hit the first 2 years, and then you have that big bump in the middle. Or you could have the big bump at the beginning, like the 49ers did. There's different ways that you could structure this, but no contract is a contract that you can't rip up and further extend the player if he's doing a good job to give yourself more cap freedom to retain players. That's what I think the Giants would do if Daniel Jones is playing really good for the first 2 years. If Daniel Jones does not reach a top 7 or 8 quarterback status in the NFL after the first 2 years, at that point, they probably do what the 49ers did, and they do what they have to do to go up and get their quarterback. So I think those are the scenarios that I see playing out in this Daniel Jones scenario. And in the end, I think he'll probably initially be tagged, and in the end, I think they'll work out a contract extension. But that's just my opinion. I'm sure if you're watching this, you have yours as to what you think they should do or will do. That's what I think they will do. But hey, if Joe Shane elects to go out there and give up 3 first-round picks to go up and get the quarterback of his dreams, I'm going to support it because that's his job to identify what gives the New York Giants the best opportunity to win football games. And I'll be damned if I'm not going to give a guy who inherited the situation that he did a 4 or 5 year sample size to be able to build this team before I start to really say that this guy doesn't know what he's doing. No, he inherited a mess. And his first year, the New York Giants were able to make the playoffs due in large part to Brian Daboll and some of the under-radar moves that he was able to make, guys like Isaiah Hodgins. So I'm excited to see how this all plays out because, quite frankly, I'm sick of thinking about it. I'm sick of talking about it. The other thing that I want to ask you guys, and I should have said this at the top of the video because I know a lot of you guys probably didn't make it till the end, I plan on doing a weekly live stream throughout the offseason. Hangout, whatever you want to call it. Let me know in the comments below what day works the best for you, and I'll make it work. So what day you guys would prefer. Also, some future content that I plan on doing. I don't know if it's going to be live. I don't know if it's going to be video format. Starting this week, I'm going to start looking at the prospects with another individual who I'm really looking forward to bringing on the channel for a weekly, potentially dual show weekly, where we dive into individual prospects that the New York Giants could potentially draft in this year's draft. So we're going to get a lot more draft content up and running on the channel. Looking forward to that. And I'm sure there's going to be rumors along the way for free agency and everything else. But I wanted to get out there a video talking about all the pros and cons for all the potential scenarios that I could realistically see the New York Giants facing with this Daniel Jones situation and giving my full opinion on all of it. That's where I stand. And those are the options that Joe Shane is presented with. In the end, as I've said for about, 12 weeks, I think Daniel Jones suits up for the Giants in 2023. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe. Drop a comment. Maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.